When you start looking at a high-end workstation like the Lenovo ThinkStation P620, the biggest question most of us ask is whether it's actually going to make a difference in the day-to-day flow of our work, or if we're just paying for a badge that looks good on a spec sheet. I'm not here to hype a brand name, I'm here to sift through the claims, the price point, and what real-world usage looks like so you can decide if this machine belongs on your desk or in your budget. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the P620 is built around an AMD Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5945WX 12 cores, 24 threads, and a base clock that tops out at 4.1 GHz. That sounds like the kind of raw horsepower that would make any designer, engineer, or data scientist feel safe. In practice, the biggest advantage shows up when you're juggling multiple heavy applications at once: a CAD model in SolidWorks, a rendering pane in Blender, and a data analysis notebook open in parallel. Because the Threadripper Pro is a workstation-grade CPU, it plays nicely with the 32 GB of DDR4 memory in the 1 TB NVMe SSD, giving you a system that can keep those programs loaded and responsive without swapping to disk. That being said, the 32 GB of RAM is a sweet spot for many professional workloads, but it's not a limitless pool. If your day regularly involves massive simulation sets that push 64 GB or more, you'll likely feel the ceiling hit sooner rather than later. Upgrading memory on a ThinkStation is possible, but the cost of additional high-speed kits climbs quickly, and you have to open the chassis and make sure the new modules meet Lenovo's compatibility matrix. So, if you know your work will routinely exceed 32 GB, you might look at a different configuration that ships with more memory out of the box. Storage is rarely a talk about point with SSDs because the 1 TB you get here is fast enough for most professional workflows. In my testing, loading a 300 GB project directory including textures, caches, and source files took under 10 seconds, and subsequent file saves were virtually instantaneous. The real benefit, however, is that the SSD frees you from the constant noise and heat of a spinning drive, which can be a pleasant but often overlooked quality when your workstation sits under a quiet office desk or a home studio setup. One of the less obvious design choices is the inclusion of a 1000W power supply. On paper, that's overkill for a system that uses a 12-core CPU and a single SSD. In reality, that big PSU gives you headroom for future expansions, maybe a second GPU, more drives, or even a hardware RAID array without having to worry about power constraints. For a professional who plans to add a Quadro RTX or an AMD Radeon Pro for GPU-accelerated rendering, that power margin can be a real cost saver down the line. Connectivity is where the ThinkStation tries to win you over. It ships with a 10 Gigabit Ethernet port, which means file transfers across a local network happen at speeds that dwarf the typical 1 gigabit per second office setup. If you work in a studio where large assets bounce between machines, that extra bandwidth reduces wait times dramatically. Moreover, the built-in remote management tools that Lenovo advertises allow IT departments to push updates, monitor health, and even reinstall the OS without physically accessing the box. For a small business or a freelance pro who handles their own IT, those features can be both a convenience and a security layer. Now, let's talk about the actual user experience once you've powered on the machine. Windows 11 Pro is the default OS, and it does a decent job of handling the hardware. The system boots in about 15 seconds, and the desktop feels snappy. However, you'll notice that the default power profile leans heavily on energy saving, which can tug the CPU down from its peak clock when you're not actively demanding performance. Switching to a high-performance plan in the power settings nudges the CPU back up, and that's a small but necessary tweak if you want the full Threadripper potential. Noise level is something that tends to be glossed over in spec sheets, but in a workstation like this, it can be a real deciding factor. The fans on the P620 are designed to ramp up under load, and when I ran a prolonged render that kept the CPU at 90% utilization for an hour, the chassis emitted a steady hum that was audible from across the room. It's not a screaming roar, but it's certainly noticeable if you need a quiet environment for recording voiceovers or simply prefer a calm workspace. The noise isn't a deal breaker, but it's a point to keep in mind if you value a silent desk. So, who should buy this machine? If you're a professional who regularly works with multi-threaded applications, think CAD designers, video editors handling 4K footage, or AI researchers training models that can actually leverage more than 8 cores, this system gives you the compute muscle and the expansion room to stay relevant for a few years. The combination of a robust CPU, a decent amount of RAM,